Now, would you look at what just showed up? Ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da. Volume 20. And now on the shelf she goes. Also, I got Dress Up Darling too. I don't really know where to put it, so there we go. But hello, welcome back to another Mushoku Tensei episode review where I will be going over the anime, manga, and light novel, talking about everything and everything that happens in them because the anime skips a lot of stuff. And so I am going to be catching you guys up on everything that happens leading up to season 2. So let's get into episode 5, A Young Lady in Violence. Rudius tries to talk to Miss Ghislaine before she interrupts him, saying to drop the miss, but then she whips the letter at his head. Ghislaine can't read, so she asks for him to read it aloud. And Paul's letter says that the muscle brain Ghislaine couldn't explain things properly, so he'll have to. And at that, Ghislaine jumps from her seat, almost breaking the carriage before Rudius tells her to calm down. And Paul then explains that he had found Rudy a job to tutor a 9-year-old girl in Roa. Compared to Sharon Kingdom or even Ranoa Kingdom, the Citadel of Roa is basically in their backyard and is just a short distance away. Paul then explains that Ghislaine is their family's bodyguard and sword instructor, and in exchange for teaching Rudy swordsmanship, she'd like Rudy to tutor her as well and to not laugh at such a request. Because again, she's got muscle for brains. Ghislaine is about to slice down Rudy before he worriedly continues to read the letter. He's like, okay, come on, we're just gonna continue on with the letter, alright? This is what Paul is saying, not what I'm saying. But according to Paul, she is a sword king, and again, here's the list. So she is pretty strong compared to Paul. For a reminder, Rudius is a beginner in the Sword God and Water God style, while Paul is 2 tiers above, being advanced in Sword God, Water God, and North God. Meanwhile, Ghislaine is 2 tiers above him and is a Sword King. Paul has never beaten her once, except for in bed. And so for the next 5 years until Rudy turns 12, he is to stay in Roa and teach the young lady and Ghislaine reading, writing, arithmetic, and magic. And Paul forbids him to return or send any letters or basically any form of contact at all. Because Rudy and Sylvie were depending on each other too much, it would be in their best interest to be separated and live as individuals for a while. And Paul adds a PS saying, the young lady's fair game, but hands off the muscle brain. She's Paul's. Once Rudius arrives at the estate, he's greeted by 3 beast folk maids, a bunny girl, a cat girl, and a dog girl. And there's notably a lot of beast folk here. Rudius gets a drink poured by some big guy, and then an old guy with a monocle and a young man with brown hair walk in and greet Rudius. As Rudius bows in his introduction, the man tells him that a noble says hello by drawing back his left foot, making a circle with his right hand, and to bow slightly. But the man introduces himself as Philip Boreas Greyrat, and he is the mayor of Roa. He is also Paul's cousin. And so we've heard about Paul's connection to his family to get in places, and we've heard a bit about his family status, but this is kind of on a whole other level. But Rudius then explains what he knows, that if he tutors the young lady for 5 years, Philip will pay for Rudius's tuition to Ranoa University. However, according to Philip, that isn't an accurate description of the situation. Rudius is brought in to meet the young lady who's currently being attended by a goat beastman, and with crimson hair, she turns around and is like, what the hell are you doing? You're gonna tutor me? This kid's younger than me. But Rudius says that age shouldn't really matter, but for arguing, he gets a slap in the face. And in order to teach her what it's like, he gives her a nice slap on the cheek right back. And in response to his response, he gets decked in the face by Eris's legendary Boreas punch. But she climbs on top of him and just starts beating the crap out of him, and Rudy has to blow her away with magic and run and hide in fear of his life. We then cut to the afternoon where Rudius reports to Philip that he's never seen such a vicious creature in his life. I mean, he's never seen such an innocent young lady before in his life. Totally, Eris is wonderful. But then Philip asks if Rudy is ready to give up, but Rudius says that he will not. It would feel pretty pathetic for him to crawl back to Paul at this stage. However, according to Philip, no other teacher has made it past the first day, and so Rudius is really in for a real test here. But Rudius thinks that he could just take the Paul approach and just beat her into submission, but that probably wouldn't go well. So instead, he wants to create a play of sorts. As Rudius is in bed, he forms a plan and then later explains it to Philip. But then he realizes that he had forgotten the holy relic back at home, but thankfully still has Roxy's meager charm with him. He then prays to her to help him lead him to success. And now we cut to the next day, or rather the next night, where Rudius finds himself tied up and thrown into a crate. He's in some dingy cellar that's riddled with mice. He then finds Eris and goes, "Oh no, we've been kidnapped. Oh, if only you could just burn the rope off of your hands, that would make things so much easier." But then Eris ignores him and just starts banging on the front door, begging for Ghislaine, but then it just bursts open and she's knocked to the ground. A large man with scars all over his face enters and kicks Eris halfway across the room. And at this point, Rudy starts to think that he's taking it just a little bit too far, because of course, he's just an actor. And this is just going according to plan, but then the man starts to seriously wail on Eris, stomping her head into the ground. But Rudius looks over to find Eris with blood pooling out of her mouth. I think she's even missing a couple teeth, as she says that the man will pay for what he's done and that she'll tell her grandfather. Rudius then casts a beginner tier healing spell to heal the worst of her wounds, but he won't heal all of it because he wants her to heal the rest. But of course, she doesn't know how to. Rudius then overhears the men talking outside about how they shouldn't kill the kids, but they do only need Rudius, so who cares what happens to the girl. However, just letting you guys know, that's not true. They are there for Eris, not Rudius. So I don't know, maybe I found a bad translation or something, but yeah, it's weird that they're saying that because we find out eventually that, yeah, no, they're after Eris. But regardless, at this point, Rudius starts to suspect that the plan kind of derailed at some point, and it seems like it's a real kidnapping. But not wanting to show that violence is the answer, Rudius makes an escape rather than to beat them, especially not knowing how strong they are. But Rudius basically just Shigaraki style, like, disintegrates the wall that some, like, window bars are connected to, and he's able to just pull it off. Rudius is ready to hop out and leave, but before he does, he reinforces the door and says that he'll help Eris escape if she promises not to be violent and to not shout. And then she reluctantly agrees and they make their escape. Rudius uses X healing on her and Eris immediately starts shouting. Because why should Eris keep a promise to Rudius? Like, who cares about this kid? But then Rudius just like, fuck it, whatever, goodbye. But Eris overhears the goons talking, and then she kind of just like scampers over to Rudius going like, "I didn't mean that, I'll listen to you. I was just joking before." But according to the sign, they are at a coach fair in a town called Wyden, which is near Roa. And Rudius then tells Eris that if she could read and do math, she'd easily be able to make it home on her own. But she then says that he could just do all that for her. But Rudius says that he doesn't even work for Eris, so he's not even her tutor technically, so why should he have to do any of this? They hitch a ride in a carriage and make their way back to Roa, and now the young lady is getting a little tired. And although things were a little bit bumpy, they mostly went according to plan. That is, until Rudius found the guy who poured them a drink at the manor. As Rudius runs towards him, Eris gets yeeted and kidnapped from behind, and they escape through an alleyway, and Rudius creates a stone wall in front of them blocking their path. As Eris is in the guy's arms, she starts to yell, but then she covers her own mouth because she made a promise after all to stay quiet. The goons say that they'll give Rudius a cut if he lets them go, specifically about 100 pieces of Asuran gold, which would pay for over 10 enrollments at Renoa University. Ignoring their offer, Rudius creates a fireball and launches it up into the air. It then explodes into a beautiful pink firework to Eris's amazement. And Rudius runs forward with some stone cannons and lobs them at the guys, which explode in their faces, creating a dust cloud. Rising a pillar from the ground from underneath the man who's holding Eris, he crushes his special place. Running in and catching her, Rudius lobs another stone cannon at one of the other guys as a distraction, before using an explosion to propel himself backwards in the air with Eris in tow. In the air, he fires 3 fireballs and uses Quagmire to lock the goons in place. The man slices through the 3 fireballs and throws his sword at Rudius. That ruthlessness is the North God style staple. A mere moment before it hits Rudius, the sword shatters into countless different pieces as Ghislaine kind of drops from the sky. And in a single strike, she is able to kill the 2 goons. Just Ghislaine's speed alone is able to create a shockwave and crack and break the walls around her and burst Rudius's eardrums. So Ghislaine here definitely broke the sound barrier, which would require her to travel over 1,200 kilometers per hour. And so this makes sense as the human eye can only perceive objects moving no more than like 800 kilometers an hour. And so having her nearly double that, I would say make a bit of sense given the visual of sound and color literally not being able to keep up with her. Although if we take the lack of color like legitimately, that means that Ghislaine is moving faster than the speed of light. And I'm not exactly sure if she's doing that. However, later on when we revisit the scene in the light novel, I think she might actually be traveling as fast as light. But just using the 1200 base kilometers an hour, that is still only like half the speed of a bullet in comparison. However, we are talking about just movement speed here, and it's arguable that she's not even at like 100%. Yes, she's protecting Eris, but these are a bunch of low-level goons. And this 1200 kilometer movement speed isn't even accounting for the combat speed, which is usually going to be higher. And so I am no power scaler, and by no means am I well versed in math, but Ghislaine here, from my estimates, is exerting anywhere between 340,000 joules of force all the way to over 7.8 million joules. If you like the math, here, these are how I got both numbers. It could be pretty incorrect, but this is just what I came to a conclusion of. But I do want to get more like well-versed on the subject of power scaling and all that stuff, because one day I would definitely love to make a video talking about the power scaling of Mushoku Tensei. But for now, this is like my elementary school level version of that. But anyway, Eris cries out to Ghislaine and runs over to her while Rudius is on the ground, terrified at the sight that beholds him. I mean, if you see two decapitated men with like their blood spilling over to you, you'd probably have a similar reaction. And so once the gang heads over to the Boreas estate, Eris collapses to the ground in exhaustion, and Ghislaine takes the filthy traitor away as Philip tries to comfort his daughter. Eris, however, gets up and asks Rudius if she can talk, which he says that she can, and so she walks away in silence. But Rudius thinks to himself that he basically failed and that he literally could have died, and he never thought about what would happen if he were to die again. This time it could be permanent. And so as he starts to leave the courtyard on his own, he hears a yell from behind him. The gracious young lady gives Rudius the special permission to call her Eris. Not young lady, not Miss Eris, just Eris. And so, hooray, Rudius has his first ever job. Pretty fun episode overall, nice power scaling in there. We get to see Eris, best girl Eris, at least until Roxy gets more screen time, and then she becomes my personal favorite later on. But at the moment, Eris is absolute best girl. And so I cannot wait to talk more about her in the upcoming episodes. But for right now, we are moving on to the manga. As the chapter begins, Rudius finds out that he's headed to the citadel of Roa, which is the largest city in Fitoan territory. And once Rudius enters the Boreas estate, he isn't met by Philip, but rather Soros Boreas Greyrat, the head of the Boreas family and the lord of Fitoa. And he is Paul's uncle, which would mean that he is Rudius's great uncle. And Philip is Soros' son, meaning that he is Paul's cousin. And so Soros, upon meeting Rudius, got extremely angry and yelled when he bowed to him. However, he still applauded his efforts for trying to be cordial. Philip then explains that the Boreas family greeting is not a simple bow like Rudius did, but rather you place your right hand across your chest and give a slight bow. But according to Philip, Eris has only ever gotten close to 2 tutors in the past, Ghislaine being one of them, and the other is unnamed for now. But before Rudius can even enter the room to meet Eris, he is met with a strong fist to the face that sends him flying to the ground. Yelling much like her grandfather Soros, she says that she'd never learn from someone smaller and younger than herself. And after Rudius returns the favor and slaps Eris in her rage that he can only describe as a splitting image of the Buddha's guardian Neo, they have a little scrap before Rudius pushes her off, and he says that she's much less of a spoiled rich brat and rather is more like a mad dog. But Tomas the butler was apparently the one who set the whole kidnapping up and was overly excited about the whole thing. And for the most part, the kidnapping goes pretty similar how it does in the anime, but you can really see the fear on Eris's face a lot more than you can in the anime. That's something that I don't think the manga gets enough credit for. Despite being a little bit more comedic than the anime and light novel at times, it also brings in the fear and darkness that the light novel has, and what the anime just doesn't represent. But as they escape the room, Eris instantly yells and say that they've made it this far and so they'll be fine now, before almost immediately hearing the voices and runs to Rudius's side and hires him as a tutor on the spot. So according to the sign that Eris can't read, they are in the town of Wyden, which is only about 2 towns away from Roa. And so they'll have to get a stagecoach to the next town over and stay overnight in an inn before getting another stagecoach to finish the journey. However, before they do that, Eris needs to pee for some reason. We get a whole page dedicated to that, and I'm delighted. That's great. What an awesome plot. But she wants him to wait like right outside the door, which is kind of adorable. But then once they return to Roa, Eris is basically just a walking corpse. But Rudius reassures her at this point that they should be safe, to which in response, she gives him a nice wide-eyed smile. And then she gets kidnapped. Rudius tracks down the goons and then follows them into an alleyway before blocking their exit with a stone wall. One of the goons says, "Hey kid, you don't know what you're messing with and you should back off." But then in response, Rudius goes, "Oh no, I'm not just a normal kid," and then he lights his finger on fire with like the silent spell casting. And then one of the goons goes, "Alright wizard, we'll give you a cut. Want bitches? Want money? You seem pretty smart. Actually, you don't happen to be one of those demons that was born into a human's body, are you? Come on, at least you know the importance of money." What is this accent? I'm not going to talk like that anymore. But then we get a shot of Rudius in his past life explaining how he used to live and was thrown out onto the street with no food or money. And so it's because of that that he knows that there are more important things than just money. He then shoots a fireball up into the sky and dashes for the goons with a sonic boom and hits the one holding Eris before catching her like princess style. Dashing away, Rudius traps one of the goons in a quagmire as Eris looks at him like a knight in shining armor. And it's at this point that both women that Rudius has swooned are now both emotionally dependent on him and that he's completely changed their life forever, for better or worse. But as the sword comes flying towards Rudius, he gets a flashback of Paul saying that if you can't move and your opponent is getting away, it's a North God style technique to just whip your sword at your opponent. And that's when Ghislaine comes in and saves the day, killing all of the goons. Rising to his feet, Rudius holds Eris's hand as he trembles, and they make their way back to the estate as Eris announces that Rudius can call her Eris before just collapsing and fainting on the ground. But it's really reinforced here that Rudius is absolutely terrified of dying, and one wrong move can make it all end immediately. No more restarts. But that was the manga. Not too much different, just a couple like altered scenes and just a couple little expanded bits, but for the most part pretty similar. But now let's move on to the light novel. So after Rudius woke up from the carriage, and because he never saw Ghislaine in these versions of events, he believed that he was being kidnapped by a big, strong, beautiful cat girl. But no, he had Sylphie. This is a bad thing. This is totally horrible. But then he thinks it over and realizes that this must be just a part of Paul's plan. Rudius introduces himself as Ruru as a joke, to which Ghislaine just straight up calls him Ruru because she doesn't understand. But then Ghislaine gives Rudius Paul's letter, and when he opens it, it starts with, "If you're reading this, it means I'm dead. I've left buried treasure at these coordinates." Haha, JK loser, legends never die. But Paul explains the situation like he does in the manga and anime, but he does mention that Eris actually got kicked out of school for how much of a little brat she was. And it says that along with getting 2 free enrollments to Renoa Magi University, Rudius is also getting paid 2 Asuran silver coins a month. And so for comparison, Roxy charged 5 silver coins a month, and Ghislaine charges 2 gold coins a month. And so to convert this into a currency that you partially recognize, an Asuran copper coin is 100 yen. An Asuran large copper coin is 1,000 yen. An Asuran silver coin is 10,000 yen, and an Asura gold coin is about 100,000 yen. And basically, if you're Canadian, American, Australian, or use euro, roughly remove like 2 zeros from the yen and you get a somewhat accurate conversion to your currency. And so for the most part, Paul's letter is mostly the same, and Rudius is frustrated with Paul but understands completely where he's coming from. However, we do get Paul's point of view of this, and this seems to be a trend with the light novel. It gives us either more lore, stats, or just Paul perspective. But according to Paul, the battle between him and Rudius was actually quite close. I mean, Rudius would have lost 10 out of 10 battles, but the fact that it required Paul to take 3 strides, that's a lot. That's far too many when fighting a magician. Imagine Rudius was in a party with a swordsman. You simply cannot deal with them at the same time. And Paul says, I guess you'd expect no less from the prodigy who gave a water saint magician an inferiority complex. Normally, Paul is like jealous when he sees somebody stronger than him, but for some reason, knowing that Rudius will one day surpass him, he feels just nothing but joy. However, Paul still wants to train and get stronger. He can't slack off too much. But then he ties Rudius up and throws him into the carriage just in time for Sylphie to see. But she immediately fires an intermediate level spell without even an incantation, and it would have had enough power to kill someone. Laws ends up scolding her as she says that she'll get strong enough to help Rudy. And then as Rudy is taken away by Ghislaine into the carriage, Zenith and Lilia come out of the house and are basically acting out some kind of like theatrical scene. Oh, whatever shall we do without our child? Oh, but we have 2 more. Oh, that's right, of course we do. Paul is just like, what are those 2 loons doing? But Paul tells Zenith he thinks that it's time for him to start training again, and then both Lilia and Zenith mock him for it, saying that it's only when he gets embarrassed that he wants to act upon things. And by the way, both Zenith and Lilia are his wife now. They've become officially married. And so despite the way that they treat him and how he feels that he doesn't have any dignity anymore, I guess things are kind of okay for him. But he tells himself that he doesn't need things like dignity and pride because those things never made his father a man, so why should he need them? And so he thinks, resent me all you like. Resent me and resent yourself for letting me do this. You want to fight back? Fine by me. Have at it. Come back stronger, kid. Strong enough to stand up to your tyrant of a dad. Kind of badass, I'm not gonna lie. But then again, it's Paul saying it, so I don't know, it just makes him... To me, it just feels like he's trying to act cool to himself as he thinks this. He's like, you know, crossing his arms, just like looking off into the distance. And then Zenith and Lilia are next to him, just going like, what are you looking at? Like, Rudius went that way. I don't know. Why are you looking over there? So according to Rudius, the trip from Buena Village to the Citadel of Rao is only about 6 to 7 hours away, which isn't too bad at all, considering that's horse and buggy levels of speed. But the city's kind of set up like Attack on Titan style with the giant walls and everything. It really looks like you just took a screenshot of Attack on Titan, but it's got these large gates that allow for like horses and carriages to pass through. And on the other side of the wall are streets lined with merchant stalls. There are inns, horse stables, merchants, townspeople, and even knights roaming about. Rudy sees a group of people waiting at an empty stall and asks Ghislaine about it. She glares at him and says, "Are you making fun of me?" And on the verge of tears, Rudy is like, "No, God, no, I'm not. I'm legitimately just curious. I want to know." But then Ghislaine hurriedly explained that those are the waiting areas for the stagecoaches. Those are how people normally travel between cities, and as they made their way to the Boreas estate, she pointed out all the notable things along the way. She's like, that's the weaponsmithy, that's the pub, that's the one branch of the Adventurers Guild, and that place is better left unvisited. And the further they went into the city, the more shops there were, and even deeper were the residential homes. Basically, the more center you lived into the city, the richer you generally were. And if you think about it, if an attack were to happen, it would come from the outside in, meaning that you were safest the more center you were. And as they approach the Boreas estate, Rudius notes that it is more like a castle than anything. It made sense since Roa was an ancient city with a noble past. About 400 years ago, the last human-demon war, the Laplace War, it was the last bastion of defense against the demons. However, despite such a badass origin, most nobles nowadays only saw Roa as a boring city full of adventurers. And once they arrived at the manor, Rudy was told to sit on a couch while Ghislaine walked off and kind of just stood in the corner. This was so she could survey the entire room. But then Philip and Rudius's interview process went like this. Philip asked Rudius how much he knew, and Rudius gave the answer. He then asks if Rudius likes girls, and Rudius says, "Not as much as my father does." And I guess right up there, that's it, Rudius passed. And apparently the only two tutors that Eris likes is Ghislaine, her sword trainer, and Edna, her etiquette teacher. And so they had to dismiss over 5 others, one of which being from the Imperial City. Just because they're high ranking does not mean that they can teach Eris. She is on a whole other level. Philip explains that the interview question had nothing to do with any of that, but he just wanted to see if he had the same motivations as Paul. Basically, if there's a cute girl, he'd try. Otherwise, no go. And Rudius on the spot gives him the whole kidnapping plan just in case if Eris won't comply. And so yeah, he just went straight like right out of the bat. Is that a phrase? He just went straight forward this time. But in response to hearing the plan, Philip asks if Paul taught him that, but Rudius denies it. Paul was already popular enough with women that he didn't really have to go to such extremes to get them. Like, even women like Ghislaine had fallen for him somehow, and Philip was quite envious of that actually, and Rudius was worried about Paul getting his hands on Sylvie, but Philip reassures him that Paul is only interested in adult women, and so find a common trait between these three women. That's Paul's type. After Rudius attempts to tame the mad dog known as Eris, he goes to a bedroom that they prepared for him and thinks about the situation that he's in right now. Despite how harsh Eris is, he's still grateful that Paul had done what he did for him. He has a place to sleep, clothes to wear, food to eat. If his previous family had done something like this for him, maybe he could have turned things around. But he still thinks that's unlikely. Rudius is now trying because he's a different person now. Yes, on the outside he is another person, but on the inside as well, he's grown so much over these past almost a decade now. He has changed and he's willing to fight for what he wants and to make a great life for himself. In his previous life, he didn't have any motivation like that. But despite not being religious, Rudius prays like any other person does in a tough situation. But then it hit him. He doesn't have his goddess's holy relic. Oh god, what is he gonna do? But at the end of each day, we get a report on how Eris is doing. And so this is day 1. Name, young mistress. Occupation, granddaughter of Fidoa's liege lord. Personality, fierce. Doesn't listen to what people can say. Reading and writing, can write her own name. Arithmetic, can add single-digit numbers. Magic, no clue. Fencing, sword god style, beginner tier. Etiquette, can do the Boreas style greeting. People she likes, grandfather and Ghislaine. We cut to Rudius' plan as he and Eris got kidnapped, and his plan went as follows. Go to a clothing store in the city with Eris and Ghislaine and let her poor behavior do the work as she'd be drawn to the outside. Have Ghislaine accidentally look away and let Eris run off. Rudius would follow and she'd drag him to the outer edge of the city because she liked adventurers. And then someone from the Greyrat household would appear and knock them both unconscious and kidnap them into a neighboring town. Rudius would then use magic to escape, use some money he hid in his prison wallet, and arrive home with Eris in tow. Simple plan, right? Well, we all know what happens. Eris cries out and gets the shit kicked out of her, and even Rudius gets a kick for some reason, and then Rudius casts a spell, whispering an incantation. O goddess of motherly affection, close up this one's wounds and restore the vigor to their body. X healing. This completely heals most of Eris's wounds, and Rudius tells her to shut the fuck up. But then she keeps yelling because it's Eris. What do you expect? The guy comes back and just keeps beating her again, and then Rudy whispers another incantation. Let this divine power be a satisfying nourishment, giving one who has lost their strength to the strength to rise again. Healing. Instead of using a mid-tier spell like X healing, he decided to use a beginner tier spell, healing, just so Eris didn't have the energy to scream like she did before. But as Rudius overhears the goons talking, they always mention in all the adaptations that there's a certain man that's interested in them, and that's why they're kidnapping these kids. So we'll find out who that is one day. But Rudy then melts the lock on the door and uses water magic to loosen the window's metal bars from the stone wall and hops out, like he does in the anime and manga. Eris promises to be quiet, they escape, she breaks the promise, then immediately runs to his side like a dog and hires him. He notes that although the plan is somewhat going smoothly, he's still a little nervous about being in an unfamiliar town. It was almost like the time he got lost getting home from the unemployment office. But later they hide in a stagecoach as Eris trembles with fear. Rudius explains that they'll have to change coaches at some point. Basically, only 5 stagecoaches leave the city daily, once every 2 hours, starting at 8 a.m. This is the same for every city, presumably only the ones in the Fidoa area. It'll take them 2 hours to get to the next city, and if they leave now, they'll be on the 4th stagecoach for the day, meaning that they'll be late for the 5th and final coach at the other city. This means that they'll have to stay at an inn for the night in order to make the next 8 a.m. coach. Rudius says that he barely has enough money to cover this, and if they get scammed at all, it's completely over for them. And Eris, trembling, nearly pees herself of fear. I'm glad that they explained why they made Eris piss herself, like in the manga. I don't know why they did that. But now it's just because it's fear, right? She's terrified. In the manga, just she was kind of just had to go to the washroom. That was weird. But at least now it's because she's terrified. But once they arrived in the neighboring city, Rudius purposely chose a shitty inn just to show Eris how harsh the world could be. However, that didn't really matter because she was just too scared to even sleep. At any slight sound or creak, she'd spin her head in the direction before breathing a sigh of relief. She did this for the entire night, and so the next day they took the first stagecoach in the morning, which they did see a few horsemen pass them, and they made their way back to Roa. Eris, despite having bloodshot eyes from lack of sleep, somehow didn't really seem overly tired, or at least she was able to hide it. However, with Rudius finally feeling safe in Roa, he lets his guard down and Eris gets nabbed. Their battle against the goons goes pretty similar how it does in the manga, except Rudius manages to cut one of the goons' arms off with a sonic blast, with the rest of it pretty much going how it does in the anime and manga. However, I would like to revisit the feats that Ghislaine performed. The initial destruction of the sword is described as a brown blur moving in front of Rudius as he heard the sound of porcelain shattering as the sword instantly fell apart. That sounds pretty accurate from what I deduced from the anime. However, what I didn't cover too much was her killing the two goons. Yes, I did the whole 1200 kilometers an hour thing, but the moment that Ghislaine puts her hand on the sword, in the light novel it's described, right as she puts her hand on the sword, the tip of it cut in the air with a flash of red light. Despite the distance between her and the goons being at least a few meters, the one man's head fell to the ground, and with a flick of her tail, the other man's fell as well. And so, basically, she's not just wiggling her body to kill these guys. She's doing this faster than we can even see her move. So with stuff like this, Ghislaine seemed to have performed some ridiculous move that possibly lived up to the 8 million joules I described before. However, Ghislaine also states that what she did wasn't overly special or fast compared to any other Dodolia warrior. And to be clear, her name is Ghislaine Dodolia from the Dodolia tribe and comes from the Dolia village. There are lots of beast race tribes and it can get a little bit confusing dealing with who's what, but the point is, it seems like that these feats are kind of just their normal Dolia feats. Any beast folk can do this. However, from what I can remember, her attack actually is a unique special one that is definitely above the average Dolia fighter. So I don't think that every Dolia tribe member is like this, but there's a chance that they're close. But yeah, no, she's definitely as fast as the speed of light here. However, to wrap things up, they return to the Boreas estate as Eris allows Rudy to call her by her first name, Eris. Rudius tries to call her Miss Eris, but she tells him to drop the miss, just as she had seen Ghislaine do earlier. Eris then collapses on the ground and we get another daily report on how she's doing. Name, Eris Boreas Greyrat. Occupation, granddaughter of the Fidoa's liege lord. Personality, fierce. Doesn't always listen to what people say. Reading and writing, she can write her own name. Arithmetic, can use addition. Magic, not interested. Fencing, sword god style, beginner tier. Etiquette, can do the Boreas style greeting. People she likes, grandfather and Ghislaine. And so that is it for this review today. Well, actually, there's a bonus story from the end of Volume 1 that I never covered. It's all about Zenith and her backstory, so let's go over it. It's called So Zenith introduces herself as Zenith Greyrat and says that she was born in the holy country of Milis. And although we don't get told the exact city in Milis that she was born in, there is evidence that she was born in a city called Militian. The evidence being that the rest of her family lives there. So, real Sherlock Holmes over here. But she notes that Milis is known for its long history, great beauty, and rigid moral code. And she also notes that she was born into nobility as the second daughter of a count. Zenith goes on to say that like many other young ladies born into good families, she was sheltered as a child. She describes herself as clueless and naive, but also says that she was a good child who never disobeyed her parents. She says she got good grades in school, obeyed the tenets of the Milish church, and played the role that was expected to her in social gatherings. Some even called her the perfect picture of a Milish lady. Normally, if things continued like that, Zenith would end up likely being introduced to a man at a party that her parents chose for her. Probably some proper Milish follower and the firstborn son of some marquess. She'd get married, give birth, and have her name wrote down as a perfectly respectable marchioness. But that obviously didn't happen. When Zenith came of age, at 15, she had a fight with her parents, and for the first time she disobeyed them, and she ran away from home. Especially with how free-spirited her younger sister, Therese, was, Zenith got fed up with her parents controlling every aspect of her life. She says that it's not easy for a fallen aristocrat to find a new road in life, but because middle schools taught healing and detoxification magic, not that many grew past like beginner tier, Zenith, however, knew intermediate tier, and she figured that she could even work at a Mills hospital if she wanted to. But she was hopelessly naive. Some sketchy folks who recognized her got her wrapped up into their party. They paid her whatever the opposite of like a premium price is, and she helped them out as their like priest or healer in their party. But now looking back, she thought that if like she had actually stayed with these people, she'd be used as a human shield, or she'd be forced to use her magic until she faints, or perhaps they'd even have demanded sexual favors. But they never got the chance to do any of that because of the young swordsman named Paul Greyrat. He beat down her new friends and, I think literally dragged her into joining his party. Until Alenalize, one of Paul's companions, explained the whole situation, Zenith thought that Paul was just some violent thug who kidnapped her. But what she didn't know is that the violent thug would end up being her future husband. And at first, Zenith hated Paul. Although he was of a certain nobility, he didn't speak like one, he broke his promises, acted compulsively, wasted money, mocked her, and even groped her butt and made advances towards her. So basically it's Paul, right? You know, he's kind of never changed. However, she knew that he wasn't like a bad guy, I guess. And despite all of that, he always came to her rescue. Even if he'd make fun of her cluelessness while he's at it, he would be there for her no matter what. And they were total opposites. But Paul was dependable, free-spirited, and handsome, and so Zenith fell in love. However, there were always women surrounding Paul, and although Zenith had ran away from her home in Millis, she still had the teachings of the Millis church ingrained in her head and could still recite all the commandments. And one specific teaching of the church was monogamy. And so one day Zenith had randomly blurted out, "Well, you can sleep with me, but only if you swear to never touch any woman ever again." And Paul readily accepted, but Zenith knew that he would break that promise probably soon. However, Zenith thought that she'd be able to forgive him if he did. But oh, how careless, naive, and foolish she was, because after just one single night with him, she got pregnant. And she was obviously very anxious, and to her surprise, Paul actually did the honorable thing and got married to her. The child that I bore him was a son, as it turned out. Rudius Greyrat, my little Rudy. I like that. That's a cute quote. And what a nice backstory, right? But it's not over yet because we are cutting to, I guess, almost the present. And Rudy is now crouched next to Norn and Aisha's cribs with a serious face, much like what Paul would do. But then Norn started to cry all of a sudden, and Rudy's face stiffened even more before he was making a bunch of silly faces. I'm not going to do it myself. But he was making faces and noises to cheer her up, and it worked. And then Rudy nodded his head in satisfaction. But then Aisha started to pipe up, and then he did the same for her, and it worked. And then he smiled in satisfaction once again. And at the sight of Rudy's smile, Zenith couldn't help but let out a little laugh. It was quite rare for her to see Rudy actually show a real smile. He'd often have a very serious expression on his face, or if he did smile, it was a forced and awkward grin. But watching him make silly faces to amuse his sisters and smiling with genuine pleasure put Zenith in a good mood herself. And much like Paul, we find out that Zenith didn't really feel like much of a parent to Rudy and felt almost as though he looked down on them. She even wondered if Rudy even loved his family at times. But then the family crisis happened, and Paul had broken his vows and Lilia had betrayed Zenith. She was so close to just screaming for them to get out or announcing that she would leave herself. It took a lot of effort to just not do that. Zenith had expected Paul to break his promise back when they first slept together, and she planned to dump him. Even though she previously said that she would forgive him, but I suppose that she can dump him and forgive him at the same time. But as it turns out, even now, after being married for 5 years or whatever, her feelings haven't really changed on that. Zenith was ready to break up their family for good. But then Rudy spoke up. He made some completely unbelievable story, which, even if it was true, that wouldn't get Zenith to forgive Paul. But what did convince Zenith to forgive Lily and Paul, however, was Rudy's pure emotions. In his own special way, he really did love his family and didn't want it to be broken apart. Zenith wanted nothing more but to reassure Rudy, and so her anger softened up and she began to forgive Paul and Lilia instantly. If not for Rudy, things might not have worked out the way that they did, which is interesting, I guess. But now, currently, Rudy's playing with Norn's little hands and smiling happily. He goes, "Oh, you're such a cutie pie, Norn. You're gonna be real pretty just like mommy, eh?" So cute. But Zenith describes Rudy as very reliable. She knew that Rudy was talented, but especially after that double pregnancy, things were pretty hectic. Her 2 daughters cried all throughout the night, puked half the milk that they were fed, pooped when they were bathing them, and it was just pretty bad. But Lilia says that this is normal because they're babies. But despite that, Zenith was still very exhausted, and for days she barely got any sleep. But that's when Rudy stepped in and started to handle a lot of it himself without even having to be asked. He was quite skillful with babies, almost as though he'd cared for one before, but that can't be possible, right? He just picked it up from Lilia, that's all. That's Rudy for you. But Zenith wasn't exactly the most happy to know that her son took care of her children, better than she did, but she appreciated the help nonetheless. But watching Rudy reminded Zenith of her brother, who likely still lived back in Millis. Both Rudy and her brother were serious, diligent, and talented, but the problem was her brother was cold to his family and ignored his sisters almost entirely. As a noble, he was great, but as a brother, Zenith didn't really think much of him. But obviously, Rudy would be different. He'd be a good older brother and earn his sister's admiration. One day when he and Paul were looking down at Norn and Aisha, he even announced, "I'm going to be the coolest, most perfect big brother ever." Yeah, we'll see about that one, but I don't know. But then suddenly Norn started to cry once more, and Rudy tried making faces, but it didn't work this time. Rudy then checked her diaper and checked her back for any rashes, but nothing seemed to be wrong. But then he realized she's hungry, and so Rudy pulled over a chair for Zenith and she got to breastfeeding. And Rudy was watching, not in the curious little "ooh, what's mom doing" kind of way. It's boobs, that kind of way. Just, ooh, I don't know how else to describe it, but just boobs. That's the stare. But Zenith did find it a little cute that he was doing something that Paul would do so often, but at the same time, she obviously realizes that's not really a good thing because he's only 7. The last thing that she wanted was for Rudy to go around breaking women's hearts just like Paul did. And so Zenith says, "Oh, what's the matter, Rudy? You want some too?" And Rudy goes "Oh, no, that's not it at all. I was just impressed with how much she's drinking, that's all." And Zenith gave a little laugh seeing at Rudy all flustered like. Zenith tells Rudy that Norn needs her milk, and he already had so many when he was younger. And he's like, "All right, I understand, I guess." But she could clearly see some regret on his face. This is a very unusual reaction for Rudy, and she thought it to be pretty adorable with him just being all flustered and whatever. And so Zenith thought to tease him a little more, and she's like, well, if you're desperate, once you get yourself a wife, why don't you ask her to give you some?" And she thought that Rudy would get all defensive like he was before, but he kind of just goes "Good idea. I think I'll try that out someday." Zenith's like, "Man, no fun, but that's Rudy for you, I suppose." But Zenith does tell him not to force this future woman, and thinks about how submissive Sylphie is and is worried that she'll go along with anything that Rudy tells her to do, even if she doesn't want to do it in the first place. But I suppose if worst comes to worst, Zenith will just have to set him straight. But bringing her attention back to Norn, it looks as though she had had her fill, and so Zenith patted her on the back until she gave a burp, placed her back in her crib, and Norn soon fell asleep. But just as Norn settled down, that's when Aisha piped up again, and after Rudy's inspection, she was also hungry. But then Rudy nervously turns to Zenith and says "Mother, Miss Lilia is a little late today, isn't she?" But apparently Lilia said that she'd be buying a little bit extra than usual today, and so that's why she's late. And he's like, "Well, you see, Aisha," it's "Yeah, what's going on, Rudy?" He's like, "Well, I think she's hungry too." And with every word chosen very carefully, he goes "Well, Mother, there's no telling when Lilia will get back, and I'm sure Aisha could probably wait a while, but with her crying, Norn might wake up too, so, And so the reason why Rudy was so nervous about this is because normally Zenith and Lilia would feed Norn and Aisha at the same time. Obviously, they take care of their own kid, but Lilia isn't here and Aisha's hungry. And Rudy's a bit afraid that the suggestion for Zenith to feed Aisha would upset her, given Zenith's Millis faith and all. But from his perspective, Norn, Aisha, and her were all equally family, and given where things now stood, Zenith should feel the same way. But was this really a good idea? What if breastfeeding Aisha made Zenith feel anger or revulsion? What if Rudy saw the hatred on her face and despised her for it? But as calm as she could go, Zenith goes like, oh, come on, Rudy, just give me Aisha, it's fine. And now using the other breast, Zenith feeds Aisha, and she felt the exact same way she did when feeding Norn. And she thinks like, how odd. Why did I hesitate even slightly to bring Aisha to my breast? Why had I thought that this would make me feel unhappy? Why did I think of this as some trial to endure? It was all so much simpler than I thought. I was a mother. Nothing else really mattered. Whether you're a member of the Milish Church or not, it doesn't really make a difference when it comes to things like this. Again, that's just another quote that I really like. But Zenith goes like, wow, she's really guzzling it down, isn't she? And Rudy's like, well, your milk is delicious, mother. And she's like, that's an odd attempt at flattery, Rudy. He's like, hey, it's not flattery. I still remember how it tasted. And she's like, oh, do you now? Okay then, kid. And she laughs a bit. But seeing Aisha like latching on to Zenith's breast without any hesitation and the contented look on her face, Rudy smiled with relief. And again, although he doesn't show his love for his family often, he clearly regarded protecting his little sisters to be his duty. His desire to become a good older brother seemed to be genuine and real. But after Aisha was full and nodded off into Zenith's arms, she placed her back in the crib and took a look at Rudy's warm expression. She asks if she could stroke his head a bit, and he's like, oh, yeah, of course, Mom, you don't need permission. And then Zenith thinks to herself as she pets Rudy, thinking that she never really felt like much of a parent to him, but recently that's kind of changed. She truly was his mother, and he truly was her son. Sensing a bit of warmth, I turned in its direction. Spring sunshine was streaming in through the window. Outside, golden fields of wheat stretched out as far as the eye could see. It was the picture of a peaceful spring afternoon. As I gazed quietly out at it, a sense of happiness washed over me. Zenith whispered, I wish this moment could last forever, and Rudy says that he wishes for the same. And Zenith once again thinks back about how thankful she is to Rudy for changing her mind about forgiving Paul and Lilia. Because as a pious member of the Milish Church, reduced to being just one of two wives, she probably would have left the house with Norn and broke the family apart. Or perhaps she'd stay there and take her resentment out on Lilia and Aisha. Thank goodness for Rudy. If he wasn't such a wise and clever little boy, I never would have experienced this blissful moment. She says, Rudy. He's like, yeah, mother. Thank you for being born. He's like, well, thank you for having me. My only reply was another chuckle of amusement. What a very nice story. I love it. Zenith is one of my favorite characters for sure. She's just a good old 10 out of 10 character. And this is a few weeks ahead from when I recorded like the first bit of this episode review. So I don't know what happened in it, but I'm sure it was good. And so if you enjoyed this review, how about you give this video a like and subscribe for more Mushoku Tensei content, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye. I hated that voice.